Ladies and gentlemen, no, I'm not the person who was announced. We have swapped positions from the morning to the afternoon. So Gabrielle will be chairing the afternoon session.
Actually, late morning session.
Late morning session, yes, right. And so I have this great pleasure of chairing this session, which is actually, I think, something in which I particularly should make sure that you know how important the people are who are going to present, and also that these are presentations to which you may, as I do, look forward with great interest. So the first presenter, who I would like very much to call to the floor, is Marvin Lazerson. He has already been present here in the meeting, and for those who haven't yet been able to meet him, he is an achieved researcher, professor of higher education in the Department of Public Policy here, but with a long career in higher education, also at the University of Pennsylvania, chairing also now at this time this phenomenon which the world will go and see as very much importantly contributing to higher education, the Yehuda Elkana Center. Can I call you to the floor and deliver your paper or you give your presentation on the topic of you better announce it yourself, because I can't find it here.
It's okay. I'm going to talk about why I thought European universities were becoming a system akin to the American system, and therefore, at one point early in my career here at CEU, I was making speeches and preparing to write a book on the United States of European universities, and why that would have been a huge mistake. And the nice thing about your introduction, Joe, is after I stopped being an administrator at Penn and was a normal member of the faculty, the only way I was ever introduced at anything, somebody in the street, a performance, being at the movies, was, Marvin's the former X. And so one of the reasons I left Penn was I was tired of being a former. It was as if I no longer existed as a person in the present, which tells you a lot about American university structures. During the 1990s and well into the first decade of the 20th century, it was reasonable, I think, to project the notion or to conclude that European universities were in fact becoming more American. This was so much the case, as I just said, that, I, at any rate, and some people some actual Europeans, were making the same argument that we were moving in this American-style direction. After all, if you looked at the reforms that had already were being implemented and the reforms on the table, they looked remarkably American. The triple degree structure, bachelor's, master's, and doctorals, seemed like it was lifted out of the American handbook of degrees. A European-wide system of credits paralleled, if not completely similar, the notion that exists in America that you can move anywhere in the United States at any time, under any conditions, and take your credits with you. They were not owned by the university that you were at. The notion of student movement, of course, is essential to the American system. Without it, you could not have the kind of major elite universities that currently exist in the United States. The reform efforts to link the universities more closely to the economy also has, I think all of you know, been a fundamental theme of the United States for some decades now. Indeed, it's the dominant theme. Tuition fees were being instituted where none had existed, nowhere near the scale of what the Americans do, but nonetheless the kind of camel had gotten her nose under the tent and was moving forward. Private universities, again, not comparable to the American system, but nonetheless achieving a certain amount of legitimacy and credibility. Quality assurance and accreditation, of course, has been a staple of higher education in the United States for a long time. And even what was being called in Europe the social dimension of higher education, primarily issues of access, retention, discrimination, financial aid for those who were members of special groups. This had now come on the agenda in ways that had been barely apparent earlier. Now, these reform policies were rarely called American, except by the Americans. Though in the case of the German Excellence Initiative, it was explicitly tied to American. A small piece of the American system, which looms large outside of the United States, and that is the elite research universities. The whole thing was a little absurd, €1 million to a university, to the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, was not going to create Harvard. €1 million over 5 years was not going to create Harvard. Nonetheless, there was this explicit recognition that there was something there. And my own philosophy in this comes from a not very friendly politician of the Ronald Reagan era who coined the phrase, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, and if it acts like a duck, it's a duck. And if the Europeans look like Americans, walk like Americans, and increasingly are acting like Americans, that it's probably an American system. So, nowhere was this, by the way, more powerful, which gets to the topic of today, nowhere was this more powerful than these efforts to reform governance and management. Greater autonomy for institutions and arm's length steering by the state rather than active involvement directly in the affairs of the universities, institution-wide governance rather than power almost exclusively placed in the hands of the individual faculties, more professionalized institutional managers, external boards with oversight over significant aspects of the system or individual institutions. These were all on the agenda. And now that she's finally arrived, Renata Kralakova will recognize that I lifted those 4 items from her dissertation. In fact, I probably could not have given this lecture without what she taught me as a student here. Apropos the students, I was blithely going down this path of now being an instant expert in European higher education because it, after all, was becoming American, and I knew a lot about the United States. And so I was polishing up my German and ready to take flight as a public spokesman on the Americanization of Europe. I was not alone, since people in economics and other areas were making the same point with regard to the European Union. Then reality hit, primarily in the words and faces and actions of my students at CEU, who made clear that while there may have been American elements in the reform efforts, they were certain that Europe was quite simply not the same as the United States. Now, they were never as gentle as that. They would say things, Marvin, that's so absurd, or Marvin, you're so American. I can't believe you're teaching here, or Marvin, I have studied in 2 different universities, at least in Europe, from the United Kingdom through to the deepest sections of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And I have never seen a university like the one you're describing as being European, i.e. as being a copy of the United States. Now, they, of course, were correct. If you look beyond the verbiage, the reform policy, the articulation of reform policies, the reforms themselves were always contested, always changed, only partially implemented, and in many cases, what started out as an American-style reform ended up looking like something quite different. And so the substance of the world on the ground was very, very different. Now, what's happening on the ground rarely really makes any difference to policymakers. So I continued to believe that the policy people were going in the same direction. Now, this should not have been surprising. Look, I'm not an expert on policy transfer. I'm not an expert on policy implementation. But my students were, and some of my colleagues here at CEU were, and they pointed out that almost none of the conditions within the policy transfer literature and policy implementation literature were actually on the ground available for the reforms. The reforms, so things like sharply focused reform, leadership on the ground, what Renata has called critical juncture, critical moments, where the idea of any reform, a reform takes hold, and so forth and so on. So there was a literature that says, Marvin, if you actually knew something about what you're talking about, you would never even have raised this topic. I could have left it there, duly chastised, wended my way, taken a few more, another 6 weeks to become an expert rather than being an instant expert. But I didn't. I didn't because it seemed to me that there was something much deeper going on, something more fundamental going on than just the issue of misunderstood, misapplied, misfocused policies being implemented. That is, I thought it was too simple. It wasn't wrong, and in and of itself, it could exist. And so I, in fact, then turned back to what I actually knew something about, and that was the American system. And the conclusion of this little talk, which I will move through, is essentially that European universities and American U.S. universities live in fundamentally different worlds, and that the differences between them are overwhelming and underappreciated by everyone. Let me clarify. I would describe the U.S. system of higher education, particularly at the university level and at the liberal arts college level. That system is market-driven, one could say market-dominated. It is very rich, and it is consumed with student satisfaction. These characteristics, market competition, immense wealth, and student satisfaction, profoundly shape the system's governance and management. That is, governing processes and managerial styles are built on a system, a market system, a student satisfactory system, and huge amounts of wealth moving through, huge amounts of money moving through the system. Competition is everywhere. I won't spend much time on it. Students, faculty, money, almost every aspect of life is consumed with competition, from the football stadiums to the number of national merit winners to the number of potential Nobel Prize winners in doctoral programs. The competition is intense, and it's intense even well below the elite institutions. As every sector is in intense competition with its neighbors and similar institutions. Even the curriculum is in competition. The primary discussion about curriculum in the United States today is will the new program attract enough students to pay for itself, and will the new program provide job opportunities for those who graduate with it? The answer to that is no. It's almost impossible to establish a new program unless you are one of these independent entrepreneurs who brings in, millions and millions of dollars in research and training funds, and then you just buy your way to establish the program. But by and large, everything is up for competition. In this context, two things I think stand out. The system, as I said, is very rich. Almost no one understands how much money fuels American higher education. Now, periodically in the European press, you get these headlines, Harvard's endowment is $36+ billion, Yale's endowment is $25 billion. These grab the headlines, but much more important to the system is that there are about 90 universities and colleges with endowments of over $1 billion. Some of these are system-wide, so it's not exactly 90, but 90 is close enough. These billion-dollar-plus endowments, in many cases, are at places you barely have heard of. Some of you will never have heard of them. I'll give you a few examples. Wake Forest University, not high on your list of things you know. Gabe knows it. $1.2 billion. Berea College.
Where?
Berea College, B-E-R-E-A in Kentucky. Famous because it was one of the first colleges to educate African Americans shortly after the Civil War, ex-slaves. Berea has $1.1 billion in endowment. Emory University, much more famous, 6.6. Rice University, also somewhat well known, mainly for its medical school and football team, 5.5 million. The University of Richmond, you may have heard of the city of Richmond, you probably haven't heard of the university, that has 2.3, and a small liberal arts college, California, Pomona College has 2.3 billion. Now, that's big, right? But the number of universities and colleges with hundreds of millions of dollars in endowment is huge. To take one small example, a small university that's more or less a vocationally oriented college in Ohio, Denison University has an $800 million endowment. Now, a lot of you will not know what that means, right? At one point, the university president at Penn came over to announce that the dean's chair that I held had been endowed by some wealthy donor, and at the end of this thing, faculty members went up to one another and apparently had this long conversation as to whether the $1.5 million was used to endow the dean's chair. When I left the university, was I going to be able to take the $1.5 million? This is a university that lived solely for endowment, and faculty had no idea what it meant. In brief, this money has a tremendous impact on the day-to-day life of the university. If a university has a 4% spending rule on the endowment, that is, it's allowed to spend 4% of the worth of the endowment every year, and that number obviously increases if the endowment increases, a $1 billion endowment nets you $40 million in free money. You don't have to do anything to you. All you have to do is make sure the people managing your money are relatively competent. All right. And now the endowment I point out because that's a relatively unknown phenomenon in Europe, certainly outside of Oxford and Cambridge and CEU, which is threatening to overtake Oxford and Cambridge, I might add. Add this to this endowment money, tuition money, research money, gifts, income from sporting events, income from the ownership of real estate, income from the ownership of hospitals, which many universities self-earn, income from distance education, income from patents and copyrights, etc. The numbers are overwhelming. And what that effectively means is that American universities and colleges cannot function, they cannot exist without an elaborate system and structure of professional management of both the income of the money, income, and the expenditure of it. You cannot run anything with this kind of money passing through without an elaborate system of finance people, day-to-day managers, legal staff, hired or owned, and many of the structures that give rise to these institutions, to this money, also need to be managed with cost and quality, cost primarily and quality also. So you already have, just on the basis of money, a gigantic and powerful system of governance that that may or may not, and often does not, have anything to do with the actual academic programs in the system. Turn to students, that just further adds to the governance and managerial structure. The U.S. system is marked by the extraordinary place of students. In fact, my experience has been that if you take non-U.S. Visitors to American campuses and you go around the campus with them, the thing that almost always stands out are the number of buildings and staff related to what the Americans call student life. Athletic and recreational facilities, student restaurants, dormitories, student health centers, medical centers, media centers, separate buildings for the staff, and an unbelievable, indeed overwhelming variety of student organizations, all of which are being funded by the university, often from funds, obviously, from student tuition and elsewhere. The numbers and costs are bewildering, and this is not simply true of rich institutions. Almost all institutions I know of, compete for, are consumed with competing for students and with satisfying their desires. At one point, I had a vice provost for student life, and as far as I could see in the 6 or 7 years that I had known her, I wasn't her boss for most of those years, she had never said no to any single request by the students, including the ever-increasing splintering of organizations. Again, I'll just repeat the same thing I said before. You can't have a massive student-oriented system that requires a huge amount of money without and oversight without having professional manners and governance structures. The Board of Trustees obviously plays a huge role in this. Nothing like the Board of Trustees of the United States exists anywhere in the world, and increasingly they are controlled by money managers, Wall Street or variations. Occasionally there's an African-American social worker put on the board to show that there's some concern with the social dimension. Taking together this, to repeat myself, suggests that the American system cannot function without these kinds of structures. The professional managers shape the long-term plans and day-to-day decisions. The boards are not unconstrained, but they are powerful. So what does all this have to do with European higher education? I think the answer is simple. To the extent that the governance reform measures over the last quarter century here in Europe have contained any assumptions that American patterns of governance and management, even unarticulated assumptions, should be adopted or adapted in the European context, they have had very limited success and have even failed in a substantive sense, precisely because they are being pasted onto a system that is fundamentally different. European countries have neither the money nor the desire to pour this much money and this much effort into higher education. Students are not and are not likely to be the center of attention with universities for a long time to come, if ever. Boards of trustees, no matter what they're labeled, will not have the power given the U.S. boards. Professional managers as the fulcrum upon which decision-making revolves, itself based, as I suggested, upon students and money, are not going to dominate very much in any way. The fitful application of U.S. governance and management structures is not just then a failure of implementation or even the result of the opposition from within the higher education profession itself. The European and U.S. systems are deeply and fundamentally at odds with one another. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think a very important point in the comparison in terms of GDP figures. The US spends twice as much, not just through government, but in terms of total private and public contributions to higher education, twice as much, 4%, compared to Europe, which is 2%. So that includes the research part. Thank you very much for making that a central point, but I think also indeed deducing from that the notion that maybe also governance elements might be different. But I think that is something also to be debated. Thank you so much. And then our second speaker, that is someone who actually I should introduce only with one position, because everything I say after that will belittle what he does. He's the chair of the Indian Academy of Sciences. Now, that is, I think, one of the top positions worldwide in sciences. So I leave it also at that, if I may, and introduce you to your contribution, which will be on fostering innovation in teaching and learning by breaking boundaries between natural sciences, social sciences, and the humanities.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. People say, you come all the way here to give a talk. I said, no, the talk is just one aspect. I get to see Budapest, I get to spend time here, and get to meet colleagues. I and my wife have been thoroughly enjoying this, and we're very pleased to be here. But I must begin with a caveat. This talk will be very different and probably inappropriate, but I will give it anyway. I was given a title which I had to modify, and the title had the word governance in it, which I promptly removed, and I said fostering innovation in teaching and research by breaking boundaries between natural science, social science, and humanities. Now, the reason why this talk is inappropriate is because this is what we are expected to talk about. We have to talk about policy and how policy translates into practice. And I am quite incapable of doing that. What I would like to do is to see whether from practice we can derive policy principles. So I'm really going to talk about practice and then hope that collectively we can derive some policy prescriptions from the existing practice. To my mind, there is a major crisis in academia, not one that is spoken about very much, but to my mind, this is the major crisis. And it's an extremely embarrassing situation for me to speak to people outside academia, because what we find is that there is mutual ignorance and abundant mutual contempt between narrowly defined subdisciplines. We do not understand each other, and therefore we think that what we are doing is right and what the other guys are doing is really completely off the mark. This is pervasive in academia, and I find it extremely embarrassing. The best way to realize this embarrassment is there's a art historian and a biologist, siblings in the same family, and then you try to speak to your family, and then you reveal that you simply don't understand and have no respect for what each other do. Now, in order to see if we can do something about this, about 12 years ago, I set up a new department at the Indian Institute of Science. The Indian Institute of Science is a 107-year-old exclusively natural science and engineering institute. It's the oldest and the premier institute in India, but it's completely shut its doors and windows and ventilators to social science and humanities. It's purely natural science. And I set up a department called the Center for Contemporary Studies with the aim of deliberately bringing to the people the best practitioners from around the world in social sciences to some extent, but really in the humanities and the arts and literature, and create opportunities for discussion and debate between the scientists on campus, especially the PhD students. We have about 2,500 PhD students on our campus, and these visiting scholars, and create opportunities to begin to understand each other. And in addition to these, we also actually teach an advanced graduate course called the Production of Knowledge, Comparison of Natural Science and what we call the Human Sciences. About 5 years ago, the 100-year-old institute decided for the first time to start an undergraduate program. We never had an undergraduate program. We are always a PhD granting machine. But we started an undergraduate program, and I was able to convince the people who started this program that in addition to physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, engineering, the students should have an opportunity to study humanities in every semester, in all the 6 semesters. And I took on the responsibility of organizing these humanity courses, writing the curriculum, getting guest faculty to teach, and I also myself teach an introductory course in biology. This group has been meeting every year. Last year we met in Israel, and I spoke a little bit about the humanities curriculum. So I will only spend 2 minutes about that and then go on to the next step. So there are 6 humanities courses that we organize, and we take this opportunity to teach humanities in a completely different way, not as another set of sub-disciplines. We have 3 foundational courses and 3 advanced courses. I'll just mention the foundational courses. The very first course is called Ways of Knowing, and here students are exposed to the methods of knowledge production in different disciplines: history, psychology, ethnography, literature, poetry, cinema. In the second semester, there's a course called Ways of Seeing. Here the students are exposed to different ways of communication in different disciplines such as visual arts, theater, cinema, science fiction. Students actually script and perform plays, they make films, they write original fiction, they write science fiction. And in the third semester, there's a course called Ways of Doing, in which students are exposed to the problems associated with bringing scholarly knowledge to bear on real life problems, such as poverty alleviation, sustainable development, digital revolution, nature conservation. How does one bring scholarly knowledge to bear on these problems? This is the problem. This while they are studying physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology. And there are 3 advanced courses, I won't go into that. But last time I said the next step, okay, so just one slide. The underlying strategy here is not to present humanities as another set of numerous sub-disciplines. Focus less on the content and more on the methodology. The content comes in as collateral. How do people in the humanities know what they think they know? How do they communicate, and how do they use this knowledge? And how are we, meaning the natural scientists, different? And content comes as a byproduct. So, and provide opportunities for hands-on experience to play the human. So the students write plays, they perform plays, they do theater, they make films, and so on. The next step I mentioned in my talk last year is, and people have all been asking, can you do the same thing for teaching science to students in the humanities? So the next step is to teach natural science as in a discipline-free manner, not as chemistry, biology, electrical engineering, astronomy. How do we know? How do the natural scientists know what they think they know? How do we communicate? How do we use knowledge? And indeed, provide opportunities for students to play the scientist. And with much pressure from various people, I'm trying to see whether this is actually possible. I'm trying to do this in the same institute because these students are still not specialized. And what I will do is I will tell you very briefly one of my sample lectures. And I will, of course, not go through it. I don't have the time to go through the whole thing. But I'll give you a flavor for this and see how I'm actually trying to do this. So this is a sample lecture. The lecture begins by what I call entertainment, and I show students a cartoon. And I tell them, this is just for entertainment. Let's just have some fun. I would have loved to show this cartoon film to you. It is 8 minutes long, but I don't have the time. But in order to set the scene, set the atmosphere that actually happens in my class, I will show you 1 minute of that cartoon, because I must set that atmosphere. I won't show it all. Oops, and there is no sound. 1 moment, I will get the sound ready. This, of course, as you know, is a Walt Disney cartoon, which is rather famous. Most of us have seen it as kids, and it's called The Ant and the Grasshopper. So I will stop the cartoon here and get back to my slides. This cartoon is 8 minutes long. I show this, and after showing this cartoon, we begin to discuss very casually, as one would after seeing a film and walking back home, and we start, and through this process of casual discussion at the end of the film, I actually end up discussing 5 different themes with my students without telling them as much. The first theme has to do with the evolution of modes of knowledge production. So we begin by casually discussing where did that film come from, where did the story come from, is there an author, etc. And occasionally in the classroom there are one or two students who say, this I think is an Aesop's fable. And so we begin with Aesop, and then I introduce them to the idea that nobody really knows who Aesop is, and the earliest extant collection is 1st century of our era. In fact, it's clear the precise literal form of the fable is not regarded as sacrosanct, and about the authorship, very little can be said. It is an eye-opener to the students to realize that people, serious adults who earn money for what they do, actually think about Aesop, do research on Aesop's fables, write PhD theses, and write books about this. There are any number of books that have been written. I expose the students to the books and to the idea that this is a topic for scholarship, and yet we don't know who Aesop was in the first place. So that's a sort of first level of discussion, and then we sort of try to characterize the mode of knowledge production that existed in the past. It was anonymous, basically oral tradition, public attribution to a hypothetical, mythical, original source, and then I remind the students that that's what Ramayana was, and that's what Mahabharata was, and that's what the Bible was. So that's how knowledge was produced in the past. But of course today we are in a different phase of knowledge production. Today we have written tradition, we have authorship, we have copyright, we have patents, we have intellectual property rights, and therefore we have plagiarism. And I remind the students that we are not in phase 1, we are in phase 2, so you shall not plagiarize in your assignments, so that comes in collaterally. So and then we discuss about how people actually develop software plagiarism. Now the computer nerds in the class get excited about the possibility of actually writing software. Then I tell them, but we are moving out of this. We are getting into phase 3, where there is the internet, there's Google, there's Wikipedia, there's crowdsourcing, there's crowdfunding, there's open source software, there's crowd computing, there are citizen science projects, and there is an attempt to return to anonymity. And in fact, we are coming full circle. So this is how knowledge has evolved. And then that brings me to the second theme, in which we talk about production of knowledge not as an evolutionary process, but as a one-time process. And so this is a case study. Then I give the students the actual text of this particular ant and the grasshopper as a fable from one of the sources. The students read this, and then I ask them, what knowledge did the filmmaker add to the script that he had available with him? What did he add to which was not there in the script? And so by collectively we write lots of things on the blackboard, and I'll just summarize some of these things here. So these are the kinds of things that were not in the script, but were actually added by the filmmaker. And one of the possible morals of this is work is equal to play, because at the end of the film, the queen tells the grasshopper, in ants only those who work might stay, so take your fiddle and play. So we discuss this, and this then allows me to take some of these things and start talking to the students about it. I start with work equal to play, and I say, science is an opportunity for you to actually be paid for your hobby. So if you practice science as play, that's really the best way of practicing science. But I go back to some of these, and I discuss the idea of altruism and its evolution, which is actually one of the things that I study. An act which decreases the fitness of the actor while increasing the fitness of another individual is termed as altruism in biology. And I say, look at this particular thing. In that particular film, there's a time in winter when the snow is coming and all the ants are going inside. Just to create a little flare in the movie, what happens is that the last ant doesn't make it and the door closes. And then you're all worried that this ant will die, and then someone opens the door and the ant quickly goes inside. So there is this 30-second very interesting situation. And the fact that the last ant almost doesn't make it leads to the discussion of the possibility, what would have happened if the door had not opened? Then the ant would have died. Now, if this was an accident, that's fine, but suppose it was required that the door had to be closed from outside, and one ant couldn't go in by definition and had to actually sacrifice herself so that the rest of the colony survived the winter, then this would be what we call an act of altruism. And in fact, various degrees of altruism are displayed by ants by bees and by wasps. For example, the famous honeybee sting. When a honeybee stings you, it is committing an act of suicide because it pierces sting into your body and is unable to withdraw that sting. It tries, its abdomen ruptures, the bee flies away only to die within a few minutes, and the sting which is sticking in your body, to which is attached the poison gland, continues to pump venom into your body for 5 minutes after the bee has flown away. And therefore, this makes it, of course, an extremely efficient venom delivery mechanism, but also a great act of altruism. So I introduce students to this, and that brings me to the idea. I use this actually to teach students the idea of testing hypothesis in statistics. And the way this comes about is very interesting. We come back to this last ant. And I started by saying, suppose it was required for the ant to stay outside and lock the door from outside. The door couldn't be locked from inside. Then this would become a function for that ant. Then it would qualify as altruism. Now, this is a bit far-fetched. In fact, it's not. Brazilian ants sacrifice a few relatives each day for the greater good. This is from a report in 2008. In a striking example of the evolutionary benefits of altruism, researchers have found a species of ants that sends a few workers out each evening on a suicide mission to ensure the continued survival of the colony. The tiny ant, which makes its home in sugarcane fields in Brazil, makes a nightly ritual of covering the entrance to its nest with sand. To be sure that the entrance is sealed shut tightly, a few ants remain outside each evening to finish kicking the sand over the hole. These ants stuck outside in the cold and wind die during the night. So it's not fantasy. When I first introduced this idea to fantasy, and then I discovered that actually there is an ant, this is the kind of nest in which it lives, and people have actually found that such thing actually happens in nature. But then I tell them the story of the publication of the paper which found this. It turns out that scientists who found this submitted this paper to a prestigious journal and said, we have discovered an extreme form of altruism in ants. And the referee said, how do you know it's not an accident? How do you know that it's a function that the ants have to perform? It could just be an accident. And so the paper was rejected, sent back to the authors, and the authors then used statistical hypothesis testing to prove that it's not an accident, but it is a function. And the way they did that was, then I bring them to the idea of hypothesis testing, I tell them about normal distribution, about binomial distribution, and then I introduce them to Mr. Poisson. And I introduced them to Poisson distribution. Poisson said, life is good for only two things, doing mathematics and teaching it. A practical application of this distribution was made by somebody else in 1898 who was given the task of investigating the number of soldiers in the Prussian army killed accidentally by horse kick. This experiment introduced the Poisson distribution in the field of reliability engineering. This was used by the authors to show that this ant is not an accident. This is a function because they computed the probability that one ant should be left outside at night, 2 should be left, 3 should be left, or 0 ants should be left. And you can calculate the probabilities of these things. And they found that everything fits with the predicted distribution except 0. At some nights, by chance alone, 0 ants should have been found outside the nest. But 0 ants are not found. At least 1 ant is found, and therefore it's not a matter of accident. It doesn't fit the distribution. So I introduce the students to the idea of hypothesis testing. That brings me to the last theme. And in the last theme, in the cartoon which I didn't show you, there's a very fine depiction of division of labor in the ant colony, of self-organization in the ant colony. And I introduced them to that idea. Today, our understanding of how insect societies work has changed drastically. Insect societies are not intelligent like us. They are dumb. Each ant is dumb. But a large number of ants, dumb ants, following simple rules leads to the emergence of a completely unique property. And I talked to them about that. I introduced them to one of the first experiments which was done with this. This was done by a chemist in Brussels who asked, how do ants know that this is the shorter way to go home and this is the longer way to go home and it's better for me to use the shorter way? How do they know that? And he didn't postulate that the ants were intelligent. He said there must be some principle of chemistry. He was a chemist, and he actually showed that there is a simple principle of chemistry which allows this to happen. He said 2 ants leave their nest at the same time and take different paths to a food source, marking their trail with pheromone. The ants that took the shorter path will return first, and this trail will be marked with twice as much pheromone, and therefore every further ant will use that. And I explained to them how the scientist tested this model, he built a little mathematical model, and he actually computed the rate at which ants should choose the shorter path and showed how the experimental data fits the particular mathematical model. This has then resulted, and then he did a very crucial experiment. He said, if this is true, if I open the long path first, let it get flooded with pheromone, and 30 minutes later I open the short path, then the short path should not win. And that's exactly what he showed when he opened it. So I tell them about critical experiments that you need to clinch the evidence that you do in a hypothesis. And then I tell them this has led to the idea of swarm intelligence. It has flexibility, the group can quickly adapt to a changing environment, robustness, even when one or a few individuals fail, the group can still perform, and super self-organization. The group needs relatively little supervision or top-down control, so there is distributed intelligence and emergent properties. And it comes as a great surprise to students that this simple experiment on ants has given rise to a whole branch of computer science. In fact, now there are books called Ant Colony Optimization. Computer sciences use actual procedures used by ants, bees, and wasps to write computer programs to work out things much more efficiently, to run their machines efficiently, to send telecom network, to make telecom network efficiently, to make internet work efficiently. And then I give them an assignment. I said, this is usually my first class. At the end of the class, you have to submit an assignment in which you have to make up your own fable. And I spend some time in defining to them what a fable is, based on all that you learn in my course, because I teach them about animals. And I said, you have the following options. You can write prose, you can write poetry, you can write a song, you can make a poster, you can make a cartoon strip, or you can make a computer animation. So this is based on all that you have learned in my class. So the conclusion, as I said, I won't go into the details, it is important to make students see the unity of knowledge and let them make their own constellations of disciplines and subdisciplines in a playful way. Rather than force categories such as physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics, we have made these categories. Who knows they are the best? Maybe they are not the best. Or the distinction between natural science, social science, humanities, and arts, or indeed the distinction between biology and cinema. The next step, I said, and the last part is, I said I should provide opportunities for the students to actually play hands-on experiments. So this happens in the rest of my course. My students perform 6 experiments with ants, bees, and wasps, some in the lab, some in the field. They collect their own data, make their own analysis, first without instruction, and then with instruction. Every time, first without instruction from me, and then with instruction, and they write little research papers. For example, I give them an ant colony and say, observe like a layman and report like a journalist. That's the first week. In the next week, I give them a wasp colony and I teach them how to observe like a scientist and how to report statistically valid quantitative information like a statistician. Self-reflection of the contrast between what they did without instruction is most interesting. So one of the main things I tell them is, now you reflect. What did you do when you did not have instruction? What did you do when you had instruction? What is the difference? Why is there a difference? And the last part of the research paper is for them to write a 1-page reflection on the difference between uninstructed and instructed. And these assignments are a great pleasure to read. In fact, one student said, both are important. One is like water, the other is like wind. When you put them together, you get the tsunami, is what the student told me. So the idea is to actually, in summary, I think we need to break all boundaries between natural science, social science, and humanities, between teaching and research, between learning and research, between professor and student, between teaching and learning, between class and exam, between science and art, between work and play. In fact, often the boundaries are not yet in place. Just don't create them. At that age, the boundaries are not in place. We simply should not create these boundaries. And then I think we'll have a completely different kind of education. How to convert this into policy, I leave it to the experts. Thank you.